Evolution, a deliberate yet subliminal process for all but humankind. We cannot wait.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
He's on the move.
Coming up in this edition, Greenland's magnificent cap of ice dates back millennia, but are its days numbered? Scientists investigate whether global heating is in fact melting the ice away, and with it raising the level of the sea. Legend has it that England's King Alfred let the cakes burn, but this man is the only monarch that earned the name Great. In 1999, a lot about King Alfred the Great was uncovered. The Gemini missions were the dawn of manned spaceflight, the training and experimental grounds where the most basic of sciences were tested and the techniques were founded that were to stand man in good stead for the next 4 decades in space. And in 2001, public concern over the threat posed by sandstorms, the most tangible effect of desertification for city dwellers, has been growing. So much so that China's Meteorological Bureau has launched a nationwide monitoring system. Greenland is an island of rock, ice and snow straddling the Arctic Circle. The few people who live here are clustered in isolated towns and fishing villages that cling to the craggy coastline. For miles and miles, there is nothing but ice. These giant glaciers serve as a barometer of world climate. Hidden in their layers are records of the Earth's climatic history and show that sea level has risen by 10 to 20 centimetres over the past 100 years. NASA is leading a team of scientists seeking answers. Why is the sea level rising? Will it rise more rapidly in the future? Is the Greenland ice sheet growing or shrinking? By monitoring changes in the ice sheet, researchers hope to find answers. With recent advances in aeronautical data collection, it's now possible to accurately measure the height of the ice and thereby discern its status. To gather the data, this vintage P3 was retrofitted, making it a state-of-the-art remote sensing laboratory. Global Positioning System, or GPS, is a highly accurate navigation network. It allows pilots to align the plane with a predetermined course for the aerial survey over the ice cap. The GPS data is used in conjunction with a laser range-finding device to determine the height of the ice sheet at millions of points along the survey. Radar penetrates snow and ice, bouncing signals off the bedrock. It provides a graphic representation of the rocky surface hidden thousands of meters below the ice cap. At a tent camp serving as base for the land crew, researchers work at temperatures near zero. Setting off on snowmobiles, they traverse 450 kilometers, mimicking the path of the P3. GPS receivers mounted on one of the sleds are used to validate measurements taken from the air. Huge test pits allow researchers to look back in time by examining the cross-section of a glacier. Hand coring down to 10 meters gives information about snowfall over the past decade, while larger-scale drilling right through the ice sheet has shown that climate in the past has been extremely unstable. Scientists are keeping an eye on pollutants like carbon dioxide and other gases that could raise global temperatures by 3 to 9 degrees over the next 100 years. Details from the ice core suggest that warming could accelerate many natural processes, including raising sea level. But scientists are unsure why. Additional surveys by NASA's P3 over the same area can track those rising sea levels and temperature changes. What happens to Greenland's giant glaciers will almost certainly impact future events on Earth. King Alfred the Great of England, statesman, Christian and soldier. Erected 1,000 years after his death, this statue tells us how revered he was still in 1901. The popularity of Alfred, the only English monarch to be dubbed the Great, has waned over the generations. But in 1999, this 9th century Saxon king was experiencing something of a revival. Entitled London's Forgotten King, a major exhibition at the Museum of London celebrated the 1150th anniversary of Alfred's birth and the 1100th anniversary of his death. Modern London owes a lot to Alfred the Great. The original Saxon settlement to the west of the old Roman walled city was destroyed by the Danes and could have been left to decline. But in 886, Alfred founded a new town, this time within the defences of the Roman wall to protect it from further raids. Many of the streets in this part of the modern city of London, from Cheapside down to the River Thames, still follow Alfred's civic plan. The Roman street plan was long forgotten, buried and overgrown. He laid out new streets with new buildings on them. It took about 100 years. Saxon wood and pieces of old ships were used to build the London founded by Alfred. Such relics are amazing finds and have helped archaeologists clear up inaccurate assumptions that they'd made about the location of the original Saxon settlement. Alfred's London was no capital city, more a trading outpost. The king's power base was in Winchester, then a major city southwest of London. Not much survives from the 800s, but this line of trees next to Winchester Cathedral marks the site of the royal palace. Winchester was the capital of Alfred's kingdom of Wessex, one of 7 great Saxon kingdoms. All were vulnerable to the ferocious attacks from across the North Sea. The seaborne raiders were Alfred's greatest military threat. Only Wessex survived, and that because of the king's military strategies. Between a row of homes and a leisure centre car park in Winchester, archaeologists are excavating the site of 12th century Hyde Abbey in search of traces of King Alfred. It's yet another indicator of renewed interest in the man known mostly through myths. The nearby restored gateway is all that remains of Winchester's Hyde Abbey. It was Alfred's wish to be buried within its walls. The Winchester community has been enlisted to help at the dig, but it's not the first attempt to find Alfred. There have been 4 major disturbances to the site over the centuries, each showing a different attitude to the monarch. The first was the desecration of Hyde Abbey under Henry VIII's general order to dissolve monasteries in 1539 and to strip them of their wealth. His commissioners identified 3 burials directly in front of the high altar, which apparently produced little lead plaques saying Alfred, Ayleswitha and Edward the Elder. Henry had no interest whatsoever in his Saxon predecessor. In 1788, this was the site of a prison whose inmates were charged with digging holes to bury the abbey remains destroyed by Henry VIII. This work uncovered 3 stone coffins, the primary one encased in lead. These were most probably the 3 royal burials, but the major discovery wasn't valued. The monarchy at this time was generally unpopular. This carved clay pipe spout found on the site was taken from an excavation of 1866 during a time when Alfred was again extremely popular. New evidence from the dig proves they had recovered monks' bones, incorrectly claiming them to be Alfred's. 30 years later, future Winchester Mayor Alfred Bowker's excavations attempted to clarify this find. Such was the love of Alfred then that Bowker, who was given the king's first name, was able to raise an international subscription to erect this famous statue. The dig has yielded pipes, fragments of masonry and even a piece of human hip bone, which was scientifically dated. It also achieved what no previous attempt could. to firmly establish the site of the high altar, Alfred's burial place. Alfred's coffin, it seems, was placed in the abbey's choir area some 40 years after his death. Since this was an area expressly reserved for the monks and access barred to the public, this act can be seen as a political statement by the new Norman monarchies who succeeded Alfred. The ancient monastery can now be preserved and marked out, possibly like this, to honour an ancient king who really did seem to care for his people. Alfred had important Latin texts and histories translated into Old English to foster literacy in the common man. London's law courts bear the image of Alfred as lawmaker. His 9th century written laws were reissued in the Middle Ages and still form the basis of English common law today. Alfred commissioned many walled and defended cities throughout his kingdom. No peasant would ever be more than 30 miles from refuge. With such tight defence and a reorganisation of army conscription, Alfred withstood the Danes and ultimately united the Saxon and other kingdoms into England. With the 8-week dig almost complete, a suitable tribute to Alfred the Great and his final resting place is being planned. No doubt it will form the basis of how the 21st century will regard this monarch of another millennium. We'll never know for sure what Alfred actually looked like. These are all images attributed to him by later generations, but historians are clear that the Danish raids were an important crisis in English history and that the monarch who forged a nation from this dark period truly did earn the accolade, great.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This is Gemini 3, the first of the Man-Gemini missions back in the 60s, the earliest days of man's space exploration. The total of 12 Gemini missions had several main objectives, including the investigation of long-duration space travel, extravehicular capability, re-entry flight path control, and the conduction of scientific experiments. Gemini 3 completed 3 successful orbits on March 23, 1965, which marked the beginning of 19 months of manned space accomplishments. The long-duration investigations were crucial to future space travel, because if man could not tolerate extended periods in microgravity, extended space travel may have remained in the realms of imagination. Long-duration flights tested the endurance of both spacecraft and crew. On the spacecraft side, Gemini 5 was powered by fuel cells for the first time. They replaced conventional batteries. Fuel cells were also used successfully on all missions from 7 through 12. This was important because batteries were inadequate for many future space missions at the power levels needed. Apollo, for example, would use similar fuel cells. Medical aspects of the flight were closely studied for such everyday matters as the ability to eat and sleep in space. When astronauts Gorman and Lovell completed 14 days in Gemini 7, it offered much-needed data. Planners then knew they could medically commit crews for flights up to 30 days. This footage shows the first rendezvous between 2 spacecraft ever, as Gemini 6A comes within a foot of Gemini 7 while in orbit. At the 11th rendezvous on Gemini 12, this photograph of a solar eclipse was taken. For those who followed the flights from the sidelines by listening to reports on television, rendezvous seemed almost like an automatic exercise. But simply because it was done well didn't mean that it was easy to do. Rendezvous required 3 years of theoretical preparation, integrating space mathematics into the constraints of the mission and its hardware. Approximately 100,000 hours were spent on computer computations. When crews were assigned to specify rendezvous flights, each primary and backup crew trained for approximately 400 hours in flight simulators, a total of almost 5,000 hours of rendezvous simulation. Gemini 9A gave NASA its first sophisticated rendezvous experience. 3 different approaches were completed within 24 hours, each of a different nature to test the practical execution of what was, until then, all theory. A dual rendezvous was performed between Gemini 10 and the Agena 8, a passive target vehicle still in orbit from an earlier launch. Gemini 11 achieved what is known as a rendezvous in the first orbit, a rendezvous that was practiced in the event of a lunar approach abort. During the first rendezvous, Gemini 6A had moved to within a foot of Gemini 7, but of course the two could not dock. The first space dock came in March 1966. The spacecraft was Gemini 8. Astronaut Armstrong moved in very slowly while making his final approach, until he was about 3 feet from the target. He then held his position. Once docked, the Gemini Agena configuration stayed stable for almost 30 minutes. Gemini completed 9 successful dockings, most of them performed in the final 2 missions, 11 and 12. One important aspect of docking was that it allowed the crew to experience the propulsion system of another spacecraft other than their mode of transport. The Agena target vehicle, for example, had a primary propulsion system with 16,000 pounds of thrust. On Gemini 11, the primary propulsion system was lit in a white blaze of energy and quickly propelled the crew to 741 nautical miles, shattering the previous record for peak height in orbit.
Can I have an 11? Okay, it's still up here and the world is round. You got a good view? I think it's spectacular.
A major post-docking maneuver was the experiment with a 40-meter Dacron line connected to both spacecraft. The command pilot gradually played out the tether until it became taut. On Gemini 11 and again on Gemini 12, the spacecraft was stabilized on the tether without further use of thrusters. 2 techniques were used: the spin-up mode on Gemini 11 and the gravity gradient on Gemini 12. Gemini's demonstration of docking and post-docking techniques, coupled with a long-duration capability, helped emphasize the enormous utility of manned space missions. We learned man could assemble vehicles by docking and by tether. We learned we could maneuver them with propulsion bursts from spacecraft already in orbit, and that we could place them in a fixed orientation orbit without expending maneuvering fuel. In short, with Gemini, we learned we could assemble an orbital workshop and conduct scientific experiments in it for extended periods at a time. A century ago, the land around rural Huangyangtan in Hebei Province, 130 kilometers northwest of Beijing, sustained a small but thriving community of farmers and livestock. Today, however, the land lies abandoned. The problem has become so serious that delegates to China's National People's Congress recently urged the introduction of emergency laws to help combat desertification. It's an issue that Beijing can no longer ignore. More than 17% of China's total landmass is now desert, with over 2,000 kilometers swallowed up each year by sand. The Afforestation Foundation is now heading a project aimed at holding back the desert by creating a green Great Wall, the first line of defense for northern China. According to Robert Crooks, a senior environmental specialist with the World Bank, desertification in China is a byproduct of the country's breakneck pace of development. Public concern over the threat posed by sandstorms, the most tangible effect of desertification for city dwellers, has been growing. So much so that China's Meteorological Bureau has launched a nationwide monitoring system for sandstorms, and China Central Television now includes sandstorm warnings in their evening weather forecasts. Using satellites and radar, the sandstorms can be predicted up to 3 days in advance. Xi Zhuang of the Beijing Meteorological Bureau said the system was vital in helping combat the often crippling effects of the sandstorms. In Huangyangtan, local officials are preparing for the next phase of the greening of the sand dunes, drilling wells for water to help sustain trees and grassland which will be planted here in the coming months. But with warnings also being sounded over northern China's dwindling water supply, it's unclear how sustainable the planting project will be, or if it will be effective in holding back the sand dunes. So far, many of the reforestation projects haven't been as successful as they should have been, as there's been a tendency to establish forest plantations in areas which are better suited to grasses instead. These failed attempts continue to plague the Chinese capital, Beijing. Recently, the city was covered in clouds of choking brown dust, the 5th time in 1 year. Most of the city was affected by high winds, disrupting traffic and sending residents running for cover. Meteorological experts say a long spell of dry weather and unusually warm temperatures have made northern China particularly susceptible. The sandstorms are expected to blanket large areas of northern China, including Shaanxi Province, Inner Mongolia, Hebei Province and Shandong Province. When sandstorms hit, they bring misery to countless pedestrians and cyclists during the busy afternoon rush hour. Particle-laden air gets into people's airways and can create serious health problems. Authorities have mobilized soldiers, farmers and school children to plant trees and form a green belt around Beijing. On United Nations World Water Day, the People's Liberation Army and school students planted trees in Kaiyu village, 40 kilometers southeast of Beijing. Students were optimistic their efforts would help. The official Xinhua news agency has reported that China has invested more than $84 million in planting trees in and around Beijing. Authorities have pledged to continue their fight against the rising sea of sand, but chronic water shortages raise questions over the long-term sustainability of this massive endeavour. Join us again next time when we'll show you more of Making History.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Is on the move.